さあ、それでは皆様お時間になりました。続きまして、Your VMware View 5.5 development is GPU ready, just add NVIDIA GRID と題しましてセッションを行ってまいります。こちらのセッションは同時通訳講演となっております。ご聴講の際は皆様のテーブルの上に置いてあります同時通訳レシーバーをお使いください。日本語はチャンネル1番、英語がチャンネル2番となっております。ご利用の際はあらかじめチャンネルと音量をお確かめください。それでは NVIDIA ジェレミー・メインさんよりご講演いただきます。お願いいたします。
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. 先ほどのセッションで日本語は始まっただからこれから英語が始まるだから。My name is Jeremy Main. I work for NVIDIA and I'm based in Japan. And I'm focused on GRID. I'm a GRID solution architect. And today, in this session, I'd like to talk to you about how easy it is to integrate a GRID card using VSGA, VMware's VSGA technology into your server. So briefly, I just want to give you a small overview of the overall VMware architecture and some of the prerequisites you need to consider before deploying a VSGA versus VDGA deployment. Then I'm going to talk about really, it's kind of not technical, but it's just detailed how to actually set it up. And it's really easy. And then finally, how to deploy that and verify that you have it working. So today it's not super detailed, but maybe some of you don't understand how easy it is to put a GPU in and have that accelerate your workspace. So really briefly, CPUs are optimized for serial tasks. You give it a higher clock rate, it's going to accelerate the processing power. Whereas GPUs are highly parallel processors and are very well optimized for very highly parallelable processes. Okay. With VSGA, this is a very easy to deploy solution from VMware that is typically, when you think about it, not targeted at the top tier users, the designers, because those users typically require applications that have higher OpenGL or DirectX version requirements and also need a lot of GPU memory. So for those designers, we would highly recommend to first evaluate VDGA, which is actually GPU pass-through to the virtual machine. Next, on the second tier, the power user, depending on the application, those could be served either by VDGA or VSGA, and that's dependent on the application and the type of operations your users are going to be performing. Now, the third tier, the knowledge worker, this is an area that is highly targetable for VSGA, and primarily this is where I'm going to be talking to today. From the overall commercial market outlook, if we look at the size of the number of designers and the number of power users and the number of knowledge workers, you can easily see that the knowledge worker and power users together are significantly larger than the designers. So if we can speed up application delivery and application performance to these workers, then we're enabling higher productivity to all these workers. So it's really important that you need a GPU for what applications. If your knowledge workers are using applications that may not be leveraging a GPU, that's something that really has to be investigated, because even with standard Microsoft Office applications, they are accelerated via DirectX with a GPU. So just because they're not running CUDA or Siemens NX or SolidWorks doesn't mean that their workflow is not going to be speeded up. via GPU. So these are the cards that NVIDIA has released right now. They're the Grid K1 and the Grid K2. The K2 has 2 GPUs. They're high-end Kepler GPUs with a total of 3,072 CUDA cores. And each GPU, there's 2 GPUs, has 4 gigabytes of memory. So we see this with vGPU, which is not available for VMware yet, can support up to 16 users. Whereas the K1 has 4 GPUs, with each GPU having 192 CUDA cores, and each GPU having 4 gigabytes of memory. This card, if you use a vGPU implementation, would support up to 32 users. So now into the gritty details of what the differences between VDGA and VSGA are. So for VDGA, or GPU pass-through, this is a one-to-one assignment of a GPU to a user, to a virtual machine. Now, in the virtual machine, our NVIDIA driver is resident. There's no other driver in between the application and the hardware. It's our driver, our Quadro drivers that are certified by ISVs that deliver the best performance possible. Now, you can have a single server that can support VDGA, GPU pass-through. It can also support VSGA. You don't have to separate those different profiles on different servers. They can commingle. They can intermix. It's fine. So with VDGA on ESX 5.5, it supports all versions, all the current versions of DirectX and OpenGL. And like some people have asked, it supports CUDA. So setting it up is quite easy. There's no VIB installation required. But one thing you have to make sure is that you enable PCI pass-through support for that device within the hypervisor. And then once you've enabled PCI pass-through for the card, you need to add the PCI device to the hypervisor, the virtual machine, and then install our NVIDIA graphics driver. So here you can see just a brief overview of where the GPU is in relationship to the virtual machine. Now, the GPU, of course, is in the server at the hardware level, and we punch a hole through the hypervisor, which is known as PCI pass-through, directly to that virtual machine. So as far as the hypervisor is concerned, it doesn't know anything about that GPU anymore. It can't manage it. It can only pass all the traffic through from the virtual machine to the GPU. Okay, next I'd like to talk about VSGA. So VSGA, the GPU is actually shimmed in the virtual machine. So shimming means that the driver that you're using in the virtual machine is not Quadro certified driver. It does not support the latest version of OpenGL or DirectX. And that has some impact on your application's performance and application compatibility. However, there is a custom VIB driver that's installed in the hypervisor that NVIDIA provides, and that will allow you to use VSGA and share that GPU among several virtual machines. An important thing to note is that by utilizing VSGA, those virtual machines can be vMotioned, which if it's a VDGA, it's not capable of vMotioning. So here's an overview of how the GPU is working in VSGA. In the hardware level, of course, you still have the GPU. And then in the hypervisor, you have your NVIDIA VIB driver. So in the actual virtual machine, there's the driver that's created by VMware that connects to the VIB and is basically, it's sharing through software. It's a software-based driver to access our hardware and distribute all the commands and calls to our accelerator. Okay, so what are the key differences? Now, for VSGA, you can have multiple users per GPU. Depending on how much video memory is required, you can scale this out quite well. It's always important to experiment with your actual environment and applications to verify how far out you can scale and with what performance. Another thing is, again, VSGA uses a shim driver, and it supports only up to OpenGL 2.1 and DirectX 9. So in future versions of VSGA, it's not clear if they're going to increase the DirectX and OpenGL version support, but in the current implementation, those are those limitations. So for VDGA, the limitations are that you can only have one virtual machine, one GPU. So if you have a server with a grid K2, you can only have two virtual machines utilizing that, utilizing each of the two GPUs in the hypervisor on that server. So it's really something that needs to be leveraged wisely, and that's primarily why we suggest or recommend this is for high-end users that need to have dedicated GPU resources. Also, for VDGA, there's the Quadro NVIDIA certified driver. That is, a lot of organizations, you cannot update your driver on your workstation because it has to be certified with the application you're using. So that Quadro driver, if you're not familiar with it, it's critical for maintaining proper performance. Also, VDGA supports the latest version of DirectX. If our Quadro driver supports it, you can use it in VDGA. Also, OpenGL, the latest revision is 4.3. If 4.4 comes out tomorrow, and once our driver, our regular Quadro driver implements it, it'll be available for use with VDGA. So there's really no reason to worry about compatibility when it comes to VDGA. So in GTC, our event, our GTC event in America, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, it was announced that vGPU will be coming for ESX. The current release status needs to be announced by VMware, and hopefully sometime before the end of this year there'll be a formal announcement when vGPU for ESX will be available. But we expect the advantages of vGPU for ESX to be similar to other platforms that it's been implemented with. This includes having multiple users per GPU, also being able to leverage the NVIDIA driver, and having the latest versions of DirectX and OpenGL. So this is where it gets a little detailed, and I'll try to be light on the details so I can get through all the slides. But this is just the basic VSGA setup and configuration. It's really easy. I could do it. I'm sure everyone in here, if you have any computer experience, you can set it up fairly easily. So first, you need to install the VIB driver in the hypervisor. And that's as simple as downloading the VIB from our NVIDIA driver download page and extracting from the download zip file this NVIDIA VMware x86-64, and then there's a version number, bundle.zip, and then copy that to the ESX host. Then, this is important, you have to put the ESX host in maintenance mode. That can be done through vSphere, that could be done from the command line. Then you install the VIB using the standard VIB installation method. I've just showed you here an example of what the expected output would be for a successful installation, and you reboot the server. Now, if you look closely, it says reboot required equals false. It's lying. You do need to reboot. So don't trust everything you read. That was a joke. You can laugh now. Okay, thank you. So after you install the VIB, you need to ensure that it's properly detecting your GPUs that you've installed. So the first thing you can do is to check the xorg status by issuing this command. And if everything's okay, it's going to say xorg is running. Next, you can check to make sure that the virtual machine, what GPUs it can see. And that's, again, with this command is the GPU VM. And here it's listing that I have 2 K2s in that server. Next, and this is basically almost the last step, is this is actually kind of optional, this first step in vCenter. So let's just skip that. If you go to Horizon View, where you're managing your actual desktop pool, you go to the pool, and you need to change for the pool settings that you will not allow users to change the protocol or choose the protocol. It's always got to be PCIOP. It can't be RDP. Next, you set 3D render to hardware, and then selecting the configure button, you change the VRAM size to 512 megabytes, or depending on what application requirements you have, you can adjust that video memory size. Now, a key point is that video memory for the GPU it's showing 512 megabytes of VRAM, but in actuality, that video memory is split between the actual GPU and system memory. So if you're trying to calculate your sizing, you have to understand that point, because you can scale out farther than you probably anticipate. And it's also using more system memory. So you click Finish, and you're finished. So after you start one of these virtual machines and connect through Horizon View client, you can go into the the ESX shell and check the virtual machine's VMware log file. And hopefully you'll see something that says that the OpenGL version 3.2 and also saying that it's a GRID K2. That would indicate that the VSGA driver is using the NVIDIA GRID card and everything is okay. Now if something is wrong, you can also confirm in this log file that using the same command but grepping for a different flag, and that will show that it's still using software rendering. So something has to be changed. So just by installing the VIB driver, rebooting, and actually setting the pool settings, you've enabled VSGA to a whole desktop pool. I mean, that's a really easy way to deploy a GPU to a large range of virtual machines or desktop pools. So actually adding a GPU to your deployment is very simple. Now I've got just a few more minutes. There's things about PCI over P that sometimes get overlooked. Typically it's the amount of network bandwidth that is consumed. Also, if you're using a Teradici card to accelerate the PC over IP protocol, that 30 frames per second versus 60 frames per second, based on the hardware, there are limitations to the frame rates they can deliver. Also, the endpoint, if it's a thin client or a notebook or hopefully not a netbook, the faster the CPU is, the faster it can decode this protocol. So that's something also that needs to be considered. And the impact that it's going to have on your network. If you have maximum lossy settings and highest frame rate and a very large monitor, that single session could consume 70 megabits per second bandwidth per user. So it's something you need to experiment with the settings and find out what works best for your user and also for your infrastructure. So if you have any questions or information that you want to get from NVIDIA, we have several places. We have, of course, our website. We also have a monthly newsletter, and we have a YouTube channel that has lots of side-by-side videos and videos about grid and give you more information. We have grid forums where you can ask questions. I don't think anyone's asked it in Japanese yet, but if you do, please, I'll probably find it and do my best to find someone to respond, or I will respond. You can follow us on LinkedIn and also on Twitter. Is there any questions? I think I'm on time or close to on time. Any questions?
When I use K1 in pass-through mode, NVIDIA driver has to be installed on hypervisor and also virtual machine, or just on virtual machine?
In pass-through, only the virtual machine. Did everyone hear that question? The question was if he installs a K1 to use as pass-through, does he need to install the VIB driver in hypervisor as well as a virtual machine? And the answer is you do not need to install the VIB driver. You can, but it's not required. You only need to install the driver in the virtual machine, and that would be for VDGA.
If I use mix mode, like one is pass-through and other is VSGA, then install VIB driver on hypervisor.
Yes.
And VIB driver on VM?
No.
No?
The VIB driver is exclusively for installing in the hypervisor. So if you have, for a K1, you have 4 GPUs. You could have 3 GPUs for pass-through and 1 GPU for VSGA, or you could have 2 of each. You can mix that. So if you're mixing those configurations, you can have the VIB installed, working with VSGA VMs, and then not using the VIB and just using the standard NVIDIA driver in the virtual machine for VDGA. VSGA machines are all handled by VMware's client tools within the virtual machine. It doesn't have any NVIDIA component in the virtual machine for VSGA. Good question. Thank you. Any other questions?
他にご質問のある方いらっしゃいますか？どうぞ挙手にてお願いいたします。はい、ではこちらの男性の方にマイクをお持ちいたします。
Simple question, okay?
Okay.
When GPU was possible virtualization?
When, let me see if I understand the question. When was GPU virtualization possible? From what point? GPU virtualization first came to market last year. Yeah, last year the actual product that has GPU virtualization was announced and is actually being sold now. So it's difficult because VSGA is that GPU virtualization. It's not. It's sharing a finite resource. So you're basically not utilizing the hardware capability virtualization. It's a software-based sharing. Now, VDGA isn't virtualization. It's just it's controlling resources and access from a hypervisor and a physical GPU to a virtual machine. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
はい、ありがとうございました。では以上でお時間となりましたので本セッションを終了とさせていただきます。